types of binding. If you've already been through the blog post, then I've already provided a lot of the descriptions, but I wanted to go ahead and show you the different types on the actual sample pieces, just so you can see the actual construction of the item. So I've pre-cut these 6 by 4 inch squares and then binding to go with it. So the first version that we're going to do is like in the Cross My Heart cami. So you have your binding piece, which is usually just a little bit shorter than your actual garment or the piece that you are binding, because we're going to stretch the binding to fit. And then I have my main fabric, which would be either the cami or let's say the sweetheart dress or even the essential tank. And just wanted to kind of show you. So this particular one, I haven't pre-pressed the binding or anything like that, and we're going to attach it using our serger with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. We have the right side of the binding to the wrong side of the fabric, so basically both wrong sides up. And then we'll go ahead and serge these two together. Now I'm not going to be cutting anything off on the serger since we're using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I usually just start it off a little bit. And then we are going to stretch the binding piece to fit the total item. This isn't very much just because it's only a 6-inch piece, but as you would on a tank or skirt or anything like that, you would want to pin in quarters or even eighths to stretch the binding piece out evenly throughout the entire length of the section that you're binding. So now my binding piece is attached to the item, and we are going to go over and press the remaining part of this. So we will go to the iron, and we're going to press the seam allowance up, and then we're going to fold this back so that there is about a 1/8 inch gap between the top edge here and then the raw edge of the binding piece. And then we'll press it again and give it a nice press, so then we go to top stitch, this will already have been pre-pressed. Back. I already pressed this binding piece, so you can kind of see where my folds are. We've pressed the seam allowance up, the binding piece back and down, so that it is about 1/8 inch from the top edge to the raw edge of the binding, and then I've pressed it again here. So now we're going to top stitch along this edge, and you want to make sure that when you top stitch you are getting close to this folded edge. Otherwise, if you get too far to the middle or to the back of this, this will tend to roll upward. I am using a regular sewing machine for this and a twin needle. We have a twin needle blog post that I've also linked binding post if you guys have any questions on that. I currently have my stitch set to 3.5. I usually like to use a little bit of a longer stitch length, and then of course the machine's set really slow. In this particular case, when you're top stitching binding, usually the slower you go, you'll yield better results. And again, the binding will get stretched to fit the total length of the piece that you're binding. So I'm going to go ahead and top stitch this really quick with a twin needle, and I usually have tails for my threads. Sometimes you run into the issue where your knit can get stuck or pushed down into the feed dogs, so if you have a thread tail back here, when you start those first couple stitches, if you give it a nice little tug, then it'll help the knit not get pushed down into those feed dogs and get stuck. Because this piece is so small, I don't have to anything, but if you were to have had a longer piece, you want to, pin and clip as you go, just so that you can keep the binding stretched and evenly folded as you stitch. And then again, I'm using my presser foot clear on the inside, and I'm just using the edge of it as my guideline so that I can keep it nice and straight. So there's the twin needle top stitch, and then on the back is a zigzag stitch, so you'll see that it'll have a nice stretch and give there. Yeah. Okay, so for this one, I have pre-pressed my binding piece, and you'll see that it's been pressed into quarters. So I folded it in half, pressed it, opened it up, and then folded each of these sides down and pressed it again. This is very similar to how bias tape is done, which is for woven fabrics. But this we're going to attach exclusively on our sewing machine. You can also use a single needle on a cover stitch, which I know some of the ladies do, and that will basically have the same results. But this is done just like the Sweetheart, and this would be more like your traditional binding since not everybody has a serger. We are going to put our binding piece right side of the fabric to the wrong side of our garment or whatever it is that we are binding. So again, both wrong sides up, align the raw edges, and again, your binding piece is going to be smaller than your item, so the binding will be stretched to fit the length of that piece. We're going to stitch on this first fold right here along the entire length, and I'm using a narrow zigzag. I have a 1.5 stitch width and a 2.5 stitch length. So again, we'll stitch right in that little crease, which on this particular binding piece is the equivalent of a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and my binding piece is 1 3/4 inches wide. So here we have the first round of stitching, which is on that stitch line. And since you've already pre-pressed the remaining or the other sections of the binding, then it'll be easy to follow those creases and those folds. So this, you'll see these raw edges here will line up with that middle fold, and then this should line up, it just butt up to the raw edge. Fold again will be folded over and should just cover that stitch line that you just stitched. So again, you'll top stitch along this bottom fold, and it should cover the original seam line that you stitched. Be sure to press in between each step, as that kind of helps the bounding bounce back from being stretched out, and then also will kind of reinforce those creases or folds that you originally had pressed. Okay, so our last variation is somewhat opposite of what we've been doing, because we're going to stitch to the right side of the fabric and then flip and fold over to encase the raw edges or the seam allowance, and then we'll need to trim off the back edge and then top stitch on that. It's a little bit thinner than your other binding since it's only technically your 3 layers, which would be your binding, your main item, and then what is on the back edge, or what would be on the back edge, rather than folding into quarters and stitching there. You can either attach the binding using your serger with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, or you would use your sewing machine, typically with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. So again, we have the binding piece and your item right sides together. The binding again still gets stretched to fit the total length of whatever it is that you are binding. I'm just going to use a serger on this one, but again, you can use either the serger or the sewing machine. so our binding has been stitched to our main item, and then we will go over and press, again, the seam allowance up, and we will fold over this binding. Let me flip it around here. Over the back edge. So. And then we are going to top stitch just along this edge here. But you'll see once we stitch, we're going to have all this excess fabric kind of hanging off. So we'll need to trim that back. But this again will encase the raw edge. So I'm going to go press this and be right back. Okay, so I pressed my seam allowance up, my binding piece up and over to the back side, and then you'll see we have the raw edge of the fabric. We will, once we top stitch, we'll go back in and actually trim any excess of this fabric, but you'll see it kind of gives a much smaller or not as wide piece of a binding, and then it's actually a lot thinner than what you would have on a traditional knit binding, since the others are 5 layers of fabric versus, on this particular case, 3. I've already pinned it just so that it's been stretched to fit properly. When you top stitch, you can use any of the top stitching methods that we mentioned: double needle, your cover stitch, zigzag, whatever it is that is appropriate for your project. Be sure, obviously, to pull your pins as you stitch. I just used a zigzag on this one to show you a different option for top stitching. So you'll have this excess fabric kind of hanging out here. If it's not too much, you can leave it, or you'll want to go in and actually trim this excess off so that it is closer to your stitch line. But that's entirely up to you guys. There you go.